Welcome to ePathshala. Myself Richa, working as an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science in MCM DIV College, Chandigarh. Today I will discuss about the topic post-colonial state. First of all, we should know the meaning of state. The state has four elements: population, fixed territory, government and sovereignty. And so while we will discuss about the four elements, we considered all the four elements as very much essential. When we discuss about sovereignty, it consists of two basic elements, that is the internal sovereignty as well as the external sovereignty. Internal sovereignty deals with the people living inside the state, and the people has to follow the rules and regulations, and if they do not follow them, then the government has a right to punish them. When we talk about external sovereignty, it deals with that the state is not under the pressure of any international organizations and international associations. Whatever they do, the state has its own sweet will. So when we are discussing about the post-colonial state is basically those states which are under the colonies, and now they will become a full-fledged state. When any country has control over the other state, then obviously the culture of that country is also affected by the native peoples. The objectives are to be familiar with the term state, to know the origin of state, to understand the nature of post-colonial state, to understand the growth pattern of the post-colonial state, and to acquainted with the challenges of post-colonial state. The post-colonial states are those states that were once a colony under some foreign domination and have gradually emerged as states. The journey of these newly emerged states that have been under the foreign yoke for many decades has been a long and arduous one. As discussed, the idea of state took place in Europe, and it was exported to the other continents. Spain, Britain and France explored the world, made colonies and introduced the version of state, legal institution, constitution, freedom, etc. to these colonies. The empires of these imperial states extended far, and from these empires emerged the modern day states in Asia, Africa and Latin America. The colonial power entered a virgin foreign territory and gradually usurped it. Then the process starting of suppressing and supplanting the native population by introducing and imposing their customs, traditions and habits on the inhabitants of these colonies. The colonial power tempered with the culture of the indigenous population, calling it backward, and gradually tried to erase it. Initially, a few natives played on with the Western powers, ridiculing what was there and blindly aping their colonial master. But gradually, a few from indigenous population rose to protect their culture and heritage. The discrimination practiced by the colonial masters with the local population only helped to cement the fact among the later that they were being exploited in their own land. Then the struggle for independence by the people started, and the process of decolonization occurred in the waves. The Spanish and Portuguese territories of Latin America were decolonized in the early 19th century. The war in Latin American countries was to replace monarchical rule with a republican form of government. But the revolution were a mixed bag. The instability in the post-colonial state led to the rise of authoritarianism regime. In these countries, the indigenous population had not been eliminated by the early settlers. New constitutions were produced, but they were neither democratic nor even full implemented. Economic exploitation of the native population, the poor and descendants of slaves continue in the post-colonial era. In the post-colonial state, there is a total disregard for the native societies. There is a denial of dignity to the indigenous population. The culture of the people is suppressed. Thus, there is a clash of culture in the colonies. The clash leads to emergence of many problems, which usually becomes the problems of post-colonial state. The colonial master forces its values on the natives. The colonial power consistently talk about the superiority of their culture while degrading the civilizations of the indigenous population. The vacuum created by the existence of the colonial power in Latin America led to the stepping in of France, America and Great Britain, which were industrialized nations. A majority of these newly independent countries became dependent on these industrialized nations. In post-colonial Latin America, domestic conflict rocked the continent. The civil war between the population led to the setting up of authoritarian regime which were backed by the military. In these post-colonial states, elites aspersed all the powers. They did not want power and wealth to filter down the masses. This led to political instability in the country and the concentration of powers in the hands of few. There were no respite from exploitations, poverty, and disease that plagued the common people. The leaders who had fought for independence had to face opposition from the traditional institution as well as from the elite. The leaders were experienced, and though they had a vision, they did not know how to make it a reality. They had to face hostile gangs of local elites who wanted to rule by dictate and not by the reason or consent. The native whites had not been included by the colonial masters in the governance of the country. They wanted to have a greater say. The concentration of resources with a few upset those who do not have access to these. The little progress in the country was because of export of raw material, lack of industrialization, and land which the rich, who were minority, led to the emergence of new class. The society was thus divided into the men who had fought the independence, refused to give up arms. They grouped themselves into gangs and roamed the countryside, at times looting, plundering, taking into law into their hands and handing out justice in their quest for adventure, power, and profit. Violence rocked the country, which led to the weakening of the government and rise of localism. Racial discrimination was another problem. The immigrants who had made Latin America their homes had no protections once their colonial masters left. The natives did not accept them. The blacks were in majority, for example, in Brazil, but again were not accepted. The church had amassed great wealth and had to say in running the affairs of the state. The command of the church over the culture and minds of the people made it an inactive partner to gain power through various proxy means. This also led to political instability and authoritarian leader stepping in with the help of military. The latter, who wanted a bigger say in the affairs of the state. Waiting in the wings, the army commanders soon called the shots in many countries. The big powers like US, France, etc. took advantage of weak government and political instability in the Latin American states and obtained rich concessions, access to markets, and cheap raw materials. Greedy dictators sold concessions to multinational corporations for personal gains. Bolivia, named after the liberator Simon Bolivar, went through many revolutions. Marginalization, corruption, and poverty were the characteristics of the country. After the initial experiments of framing new constitution, natural rights to the citizens failed. The leaders went about settling government, with strong government at the center. This led to political turmoil. Great Colombia dissolved into Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador by 1830. All these countries were plagued by civil wars and political instability. In Argentina, a cardinal John Manuel de Rosas ruled brutally from 1829 to 1852. He ruled with an iron hand, some trying to follow norms and recommendations of Napoleon state. For example, Bolivar recommended a powerful president for life and a life senate, but they were not followed. Government changed hand quickly and use of force became common. The struggle were power-centric. It was difficult for those leaders to establish a legitimacy of their government, which were new and without any history. The battling of various factions with each other and a weak executive led to the failure of many governments. The countries were not prepared for democracy. They had chosen a few ideals, but they remained far-fetched. The fight for power did not include the masses, but only the elite, who were divided into the conservatives, who were interested in maintaining the old order, and the liberals, who were influenced by the thoughts of the Western thinkers. The conservative followed the old traditions and had special fondness for the Roman Catholic Church, with whose their interests were tied. The cedulars or the armed gangs captured power. They sometimes worked closely with the civilian politicians to capture power. The people were too lost in poverty, etc., and were ignorant as well as passive to the political happening. The high expenses on the bureaucracy and the military led to the financial constraint on the new, fragile government. They had to take debt, which further added to the mire. The internal strife led to the destruction of the productive areas, the fields. Mining suffered and a labor problem arose. The elites who had spearheaded the revolution in most of the countries did not want to part with their status and wealth. Post-colonial Africa. Meanwhile, in Africa, the colonizers had played havoc with the social fabric of the society that had existed since centuries. They tried to erase the African culture and introduce institutions and a way of life that was alien to Africans, who were divided into well-organized tribes. The colonizer used the divide and rule policy, pitting clans and tribes against each other and taking their fertile land. They took advantage of the enmity between the tribes and subdued them by turn. The alien system was imposed on the people, leaving them confused. People were introduced to Christianity, and consciousness led to the new strange infighting among people of the same tribe, for each tribe had its own religious belief. It did not take long in these circumstances for political and social instability for authoritarian leaders to grab power. The military was another beneficiary which got a chance to come out of barracks into the street. President Kenyatta of Kenya became the Prime Minister and later President in 1964 after Kenya got its independence in December 1963. Kenya had two political parties at the time of its independence, Kenya Africa National Union and Kenya Africa Democratic Union. KANU, who had pro-capitalist, while KADU was socialist and favored the poor. KADU dissolved itself in 1964 and merged it with KANU. Kenyatta started its brutal role once Kenya became a de facto one-party state, and he suppressed all those who opposed him. He encouraged the Kiambu Mafia from his district along with encouraging the small Kikuyu elite. The father of the nation, the leaders who led their countries to independence, sometimes fluttered on the way. They personalized power and set out amazing wealth. The people were happy to see the colonizers depart from the land, not knowing their place would be taken by the elites of their own country. The rulers in the post-colonial era have not been transparent. Corruption, nepotism, and suppressing the right voices have been the norm. The colonizer did not train the natives in the governance, which led to the local government falling short of the required standard. Education was given to Africans, but not to the extent of running the legal institution efficiently. The patron-client relationship, disbursing favor to stay in power, have been corrupted the nation and is proving to be an obstacle of development. Concentration of land and resources in the hand of elite is another problem faced by the post-colonial states of Africa. Conflicts was resolved by the elders of the tribe. Africa is a story of multi-ethnic society, but divisions were made broader, were drawn in such a way that lead to increase in tensions over land between tribes. But the colonizer encouraged, forced the former to produce cash crops or primary products, which were produced was not what was needed most. This led to hunger, starvation, and famine in Africa. This was the legacy of the post-colonial government inherited. The colonial masters had practiced discriminations on the basis of color. It had struck at the dignity of the indigenous population. The tribal people lost out their heritage because a few among them sold land rights, etc., to the settlers. The government had to avoid falling into the trap of neocolonialism because the industrialized nations were planning entering the resources-rich Africa by some of the other pretext. The weak economies, which were not mature or stable, needed some help, and the capitalist countries were ready to do, but at a price. The wrong policies of the colonial masters left a newly independent state with many problems. Malnutrition, infant mortality, diseases, poverty just referred to go away. There was a lack of finance, and a majority of the leaders did not have the courage to make bold and innovative programs that would help the nations to develop. Achieving national unity was another Herculean task because it was difficult to dismantle the structure imposed by the colonial regimes. The colonial masters had encouraged ethnic and regional based competition. The challenges before states is to have a free and fair elections and to stop human rights violation. The task before the government of these states is to put their countries on the path to progress. Post-Asian society. In the Asian countries after the end of colonial rule, the national unity that had emerged soon gave way to divisive force. A certain small sections of social elite who had led the movement experienced the pangs of independence when people among them started talking of power, pelf, and offices. The post-colonial state were left to many problems, some that there were had other and that were created by the colonial masters. The newly independent states was left with a divided society on the basis of caste, region, and religion. The continuous neglect of the agriculture sector left the farmer in debt and the field barren to them. They had been forced to grow those crops that were provided instant profit to the colonizers. For example, indigo cultivations in India. India was fortunate to inherit a set of formal institutions and the country who had trained educated leaders to run these structures. But these structures were weak and had to be strengthened. India has to face the brunt of partition when the country was divided into two, India and Pakistan, on the basis of religion. Dynasty ruled in India is a big challenge. We have 3 generations of politicians who have made politics their professions. They refuse to step down and allow the common man to participate a share. Regional politics have further undermined the power of the centre. The state wants a larger share, while the Constitution of India has clearly defined as a unitary state. The fissiparous elements in India keep rising their heads, which led to the Indian government coming heavily on them. This is sometimes translated by the critics as a gross violation of human rights. Riots on the basis of religion lead to the damage of public property and also to the loss of lives. Remote areas still report stories of hardship faced by the people because of lack of facilities. On the other hand, the government tries to fulfill its various promises, citing the huge participation as an obstacle. In Pakistan, the challenge is to keep the army away from power. General Ayub Khan, Yahya Khan, Zia-ul-Haq, Pervez Musharraf are the names that a democracy cannot be proud of. General Ayub Khan's coup in 1958, which was the first one in series, was bloodless. It was pre-planned. After him, the army generals have tasted the power and yearn for all shares. The country is also rocked by ethnic conflict. Underdevelopment, poverty, unemployment and regional conflict continue to disturb the development process in Pakistan. The country did not inherit its political institutions, as India did so. They had to form caste-create institutions. The structures created are weak and army continues to wield power. Interference of USA and other powers in South Asia complicates matter. Nepal is also dealing with poverty, slow development, etc. The king has to step down from the power and parliamentary form of government has been accepted by the people. Yet the civil war, the internal conflicts has taken into toll. But way back in 1967, King Mahendra started the Back to the Village campaign. The idea was to separate panchayat regime to the village. The goal was that the panchayat system should be radical and modernizing one, in lines with the land reform carried out in 1963 and 1964 and the abolition of the legal recognition of caste with the new law code in 1963. In practice, the campaign turned into the method of surveillance and control by the palace. Sri Lanka was rocked by the rift, which took an extreme form between the Tamil-speaking and the Sinhalese population. The Tamilians in Sri Lanka felt discriminated in the social, political and economic sphere, which they took up arms. The liberation of Tamil Tiger Elam fought for the rights of the Tamilian for many decades. In these newly independent states, there is a lack of conflict moderating institution both for external as well as internal matters. The comparison between Pakistan and India is stark and proves a point that each country has its weakness which is not managed to overpower. The erosion of the sovereignty of Pakistan has been all too evident over time. Firstly, it suffered under the series of military dictatorship, then it became almost a satellite state of US funded to fight the later war against communism in Afghanistan. And now it is torn by a sectarian strife between Islamic extremists and the state. The roots of both authoritarianism and the loss of Swaraj, if Gandhi is to be believed, go way back on the very genesis of that nation. India, on the other hand, has gone towards a different kind of communal politics, which vote banks and identity politics hold the nation to ransom. That much of this politics is cynical, exploitative, divisive is all too evident. The beneficiaries of any system have exploited the opportunities and become richer. Each has tried and has been successful in grabbing more than was his share. Responsibility, accountability have not been the strong point of the leaders in these countries. So in the end, I will conclude that obviously in the colonial state, the dignity of the individual affects, and when the dignity of the individual affects, then the culture of the society, there is a conflict in the culture of the society. The people are dominated by the foreign colonies, and the people do not have the say in that colonies. The foreign peoples come to control over them, and they control the people living in that native village. And whatever happening in the colonial state, it will become a source for the post-colonial state also. There exist various problems in the post-colonial states like the caste, religion, regions, etc. So we can say that the post-colonial states are those states which are basically once ruled by a colonial country.